Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidiri, and we're going to be kickstarting the show with a very, very interesting development. This is as global tensions continue to simmer out in the Middle East. A critical maritime choke point is once again at the center of geopolitical risk. We all know about it by now, the Strait of Hormuz, through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil flows. It has become a bargaining chip in what is an escalating confrontation, the war on Iran by the United States of America and Israel since late February. The conflict has disrupted shipping, sent oil prices surging, and rattled global markets. And now, in a very, very significant, and I think we can also add that complex development, Iran has granted South African-linked vessels safe passage through the strait, even as access remains restricted for others and volatility persists. And we're going to be unpacking this development and this diplomatic gesture by Iran. What does it mean? Is it merely a gesture? Is it a strategic signal that South Africa should be looking into, and how us as South Africans need to analyze it? And is it really going to affect the price of fuel, the price of our imports and exports here in South Africa? And we'll be unpacking that with Chris Hattingh from the Center for Risk Analysis, who'll be helping us unpack all of this. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. Really appreciate you giving us your time.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity.
And I think we'll jump right into it, Chris. Just from what you understand, what you know, what you've gathered at this point, has Iran really granted South African-linked vessels safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz? And what are the implications of that? And how realistic is it, considering how volatile that region is right now?
So Iran has granted this to South Africa, the safe passage of our vessels. That doesn't mean yet that insurance companies, for example, are willing to insure those goods and those vessels. Same for many other countries shipping moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Also keep in mind, South Africa doesn't necessarily manufacture oil tankers or container ships. We lease them from other companies or countries. And those countries might not be flagged as safe or as having safe passage by Iran. So if you look at a lot of our imports in the petroleum space, so imports from countries like India, Oman, the UAE, Saudi Arabia that we rely on heavily, the movement of ships from those countries has not been marked as safe by Iran. So even if our vessels or vessels that we lease are flagged as safe, that doesn't mean a lot of the imports that we receive from other countries are flagged as safe, and therefore we will still have to deal with the sort of consequences of that in terms of supply, in terms of imports for the time being, unless Iran does increase the amount of countries that they flag as having safe passage through the strait.
Then my next question would be, why make this announcement from Iran's point of view, that they'll be allowing South African vessels through? Is this diplomacy? Is it leverage of some sort, or just making it known that the two countries are aligned and they're allies of some sort?
I think number one, on the diplomatic front, so it is a diplomatic win for South Africa. It does point to the years of investment that South Africa made into the relationship with Tehran. And at this point in time, as Tehran is dealing with the attacks from the US and from Israel, they want to signal to countries that they are allied with around the world, that they have, that their vessels, that their trade has safe passage. So on the one hand, the diplomatic side. Perhaps on the leverage side, this could point to Iran trying to signal to countries it wants to engage with it more proactively, to put pressure on the US, to put pressure on Israel, to put pressure on other countries in the Gulf, in terms of negotiations that are ongoing on a daily basis in the background through various intermediaries. A sort of proposal was floated over the weekend from Iran's side that the US did not accept. We'll see if there's any counters that happen today or tomorrow into the rest of this week. But at the moment, I think it's an interesting move by Iran, and it's possibly trying to signal that they continue to enjoy strong relationships with countries around the world, that countries like the US and Israel maybe then hadn't considered or hadn't calculated. Maybe over time, this will then feed into some recalculations, not yet, because the hard power leverage is on the side of the US and of Israel. However, because Iran is in the strategic position that it is such a big country in the Middle East in terms of population, in terms of resources, in terms of leverage it can apply. It's interesting how some of these diplomatic calculations could factor in at some point.
I want to come back to the Strait of Hormuz in itself, and just generally, could we possibly come to a point where we are seeing the emergence of an almost tiered access system to the strait itself, and the global trade routes that go along with, where you have allies and you have adversaries, and it's decided on which side of the fence you lean on whether or not you get to access some of these trading routes?
This could very much be an outflow of the sort of multipolar world that we're seeing emerging more and more sort of through 2023, 2024, now into 2025 and into 2026, where countries, they use leverage points in trade and investment negotiations that they might not have used beforehand, that some of those tools were used and seen as neutral. Now they're being used even by countries like the United States, which is bringing in non-trade issues into trade negotiations, into investment flows, into all that, those kinds of discussions and deals. So for Iran, talk about this sort of taxing or tariffing containers, ships, and goods that move through the Strait of Hormuz. Could very much be a possibility. Of course, the downside risk then is that you possibly incentivize the movement of goods through other straits around the world, through other canals, through other pipelines. Saudi Arabia is trying to invest a lot in overland pipelines to move oil to almost circumvent the Strait of Hormuz. So then you incentivize the creation of those kinds of things, which lessen the leverage that you have in areas like the Strait of Hormuz. At the moment, around 20% of global oil that is moved on the world's oceans, it moves through the strait. So even if you build those pipelines and alternatives, the Strait of Hormuz will remain very important to global oil supply, gas supply, fertilizer, all those kinds of goods that go into all sorts of sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, that kind of thing. But at the moment, it is noteworthy that countries around the world, sort of your superpowers like the US and China, but also your middle powers, as Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, referred to them, like Iran, South Africa, India. They're trying to look at where they can extend more leverage in these kinds of global maneuverings.
And I think the key word that you're mentioning there is trying to circumvent this current situation. There were talks that the Cape of Good Hope could be very, very critical also. Concerning trading routes with the Strait of Hormuz being closed. How realistic is that? And is South Africa, I think, in the future going to be a key route for trade and for vessels looking to circumvent the closing of the Strait of Hormuz? And are we capable to handle large volumes of traffic like the Strait of Hormuz has?
I think the Cape route will always be important globally. If you, for example, close the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Panama Canal, then just from a sort of pure volumes point of view, the Cape route then becomes the most important in the world. Whether you can secure it is a different question. We're all unfortunately familiar with the limitations of the SANDF and the South African Navy. You need many more patrol vessels just to protect shipping from things like piracy, and also to help in rescue operations and that kind of thing around the Cape route. In terms of our ports, we have seen improvement in logistics by Transnet over the last 12 months. So there is more investment in cranes and sort of basic infrastructure, especially at the Port of Durban and the Port of Cape Town, but they're not at the sort of level where they could be or should be. So hopefully those investments continue, and then you do have more capacity over time to service those ships. Of course, the goods on those ships coming around the Cape, they're not necessarily intended for South African markets, but you can benefit from the sort of perception, from the optics of it, of being a secure trading route, of servicing those ships, of trying to assist wherever possible. So we can benefit in the long term, and it does point to, especially when things are relatively more quiet in sort of global geopolitics, as they relatively were before President Trump's second administration. That's when you need to really spend time investing in sort of basic infrastructure in your country, putting yourself in a more secure position, because then when things escalate globally, you're not as exposed. You're more secure from an energy supply point of view, from a perceptions point of view, from other trading partners and investors. Your ports, your railways are up to scratch. They're up to global standards. They can handle if there is increased traffic. It really points to the importance of investing in those things when things globally are relatively more stable, because then you benefit when things are more volatile.
I want to come back to that announcement of the safe passage for South African vessels. I think when that announcement was made, a lot of South Africans were asking themselves if this will almost assist in insulating from the rising fuel prices. That didn't seem to be the case, because just last week we saw that dramatic rise in fuel prices. Is it going to have any kind of impact, or is it a false sense of security, or just diplomacy at play, this announcement?
I think it does risk being a sort of feeding a little bit of a false sense of security, because we rely so much on our petroleum imports and our refined fuels. Those come from countries like India, Oman, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. Their vessels haven't been flagged as having safe passage by Iran. So because we import from those countries, those imports will continue to be exposed. They're not going to move through the straits anytime soon, unless there's some kind of durable ceasefire that is announced maybe this week. It also will then depend on international insurance companies. Do they then back the movement of those goods and those ships through the Straits of Hormuz? On the oil front, we are quite secure because, of course, we have a strategic oil reserve, and we import a lot from countries like Angola and Nigeria on the African continent. So our crude oil supply is looking okay. But the refined fuels and the petroleum products, that is where you see continued constraints. And even if we have the still secured supply from countries like Nigeria and Angola, even if you have that secured supply and the global oil price goes to 110, 120, $150 per barrel, that will impact South Africa negatively, because we buy oil in dollars and we import so much in terms of oil and fuel. So in any case, for the short to medium term, let's say the next 3 to 6 months, things do look quite tight. Even if you resolve the conflict overnight, if you assume that shipping goes back to what it was before the US and Israel attacked Iran, even if you go back to that scenario, think a bit like of oil prices, oil markets. It's a bit like rockets and feathers. The rocket goes up very quickly. The price of oil, that rocket goes up exceedingly fast, but it starts to descend like a feather. It comes down very, very slowly, even if the conflict is resolved in the next day or two.
You mentioned something very, very important. South Africa's strategic oil reserves. There's been a lot of conversation around how much in reserves do we have, looking at just the state of the world right now and just how volatile the world has become. Some suggest that we have around 8 million barrels in strategic oil reserves. If you just analyze that aspect, how ready is South Africa should things really get out of hand? I think what's happening in Iran right now is only a microcosmic of how bad things can get. They can get really, really bad, because we're living in a really, really volatile world right now. How prepared can South Africa be if things do really get out of hand? Looking at our strategic oil reserves, 7.7 to 8 million barrels, is that enough to almost cushion us in any way if things really do get out of hand?
We can cushion the blow, and you could also see government did announce the R3 cut to the general fuel levy. So there is some room in the fiscus from that point of view to soften the blow. That doesn't mean it can continue indefinitely, because of course that's a lot of revenue that government is not collecting. That doesn't help in the long run. Our fiscal position is stronger than it's been relatively in the last few years, but it's still quite precarious. We're still in a tight position, and of course our growth rate remains way too low for us to be a sort of robust economy to better weather these kinds of storms. If you look at the strategic oil reserve, if you look at the 8 million barrels, if you look at comments by Minister Mantashe and his department, for example, that we are secure in terms of supply until the end of April, that negotiations are ongoing with other suppliers to bring in more, I believe those statements. It's consistent with what you hear from industry and from the portfolio committee in Parliament. However, the question is, do we have the room to then buy additional supply at higher prices? Maybe up to a point. But also, number two, what do we do in terms of our domestic refining capacity? We have at the moment 3 refineries that are operational. That's 3 out of 6 or 7 that we could have operational in terms of various capacities. So if you look at our most important plant, that is the Sasol plant that converts coal to liquids, that helps us a lot because we have so much domestic coal supply that we can then use that for both electricity generation for Eskom, which of course still relies mostly on coal, but also you can convert that then to other products. So we have some domestic capacity, but this moment does reinforce we need to ask questions about our domestic refining policies. How do we get those back up to a point where we're not as overly reliant on imports? Of course, it's a globalized, interconnected trading world. You're always going to have some kind of a trading import exposure, but you could have better capable domestic refining capacity that does help you soften the blow when things are volatile for a longer period of time.
How important are African oil producing countries going to be from now going forward? You mentioned the likes of Nigeria, the likes of Angola, who South Africa is sourcing some of our oil from. Just in the future, could this moment be a wake-up call for African countries, for South Africa to start looking more into Africa when it comes to trade, oil, for instance, maybe a bulk of, oil and other critical minerals, to start sourcing them from there?
No, it very much should be. It does really reinforce the case for something like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. If you can lower the costs of moving goods and services across the continent, then you incentivize that kind of domestic and regional manufacturing capacity. And you've got a massive consumer market. South Africa, SADC, Sub-Saharan Africa will have probably the fastest growing population in the world over the next 50 to 100 years, even more so than India and China. So you benefit a lot from that kind of demand if you can supply it, if you have the right kind of domestic pro-business and pro-growth policies in place. If you look at in the past, in some instances, it's been more expensive to move certain goods between African countries than it has been for an African country to export some of those goods to Europe, for example. That simply, it cannot be the case if you have the right kind of logistics infrastructure in place, if you deal with border post operations, if you make it easy and sort of predictable, if you deal with wherever it might be higher rates of crime, especially in South Africa, where it impacts doing business and moving goods on railways and on trucks, for example. It really reinforces that point that South Africa and many other African countries, they can benefit if they get some of these domestic policies right. Not only to better weather these storms, but then of course you are able to export to other countries. So you increase then the incentive for them to trade with these particular countries, and you benefit from that in terms of economic growth, investment, manufacturing capacity, and just basic tax revenue, which every government, of course, enjoys to have more of.
Lastly, before I let you go, Chris, a lot has been said when it comes to the war in Iran. There are developments almost every hour. Just from your analysis, how would you wrap up where we are currently, and the statements coming from Donald Trump, the White House, Iran itself saying, well, they're not agreeing to a ceasefire unless certain conditions are met. Does it look like we are anywhere near a ceasefire or an end to this war?
Well, it's very difficult to say at the moment. If you look at the leverage that Iran has over the Strait of Hormuz, they will likely to continue to use that. For the US and for Israel, I mean, they have air superiority over Iran. They have that kind of control, but that air superiority doesn't equal that you have control on the ground. That might require something like boots on the ground. But then on the other side, you have the US in a position where they're going into midterm elections later this year. It's very difficult for President Trump and the Republicans to then sell to the American voters, continue to vote for us and support our candidates across various states when you have higher fuel prices, if you have low economic growth, if you have this long-term engagement by the US military in the Middle East, specifically with Iran in this instance. So at the moment, let's see. I think that the next deadline that President Trump has set is set to expire. Was it today or maybe early tomorrow? President Trump is known to extend some of his deadlines and his threats, and that does sort of affect the perception of the US and of this particular administration. So let's see exactly how they play this going forward, and how Iran also continues to use these particular leverage points like the Strait of Hormuz. For the time being, what we can say with certainty is that internationally oil prices will remain elevated even if the conflict is resolved today or tomorrow, and that will impact fuel prices in South Africa. So for the next month or two at least, the sort of advice to businesses and consumers in South Africa is, prepare for some higher prices in places like fuel, possibly constraints to our food supply because our agricultural sector is impacted by high diesel and fertilizer prices. And then also maybe in the short to medium term, higher inflation, which means the Reserve Bank isn't likely to cut interest rates anytime soon, unfortunately.
Chris Hattingh from the Center for Risk Analysis. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for those insights.
Thank you very much.
There you go. Yeah, I think very, very interesting developments there. Iran saying, well, South Africa or vessels linked to South Africa can pass through the Strait of Hormuz. They're guaranteed safety. But it almost feels like this is just rhetoric. It doesn't look like it's going to factor in onto day to day how this war has affected you and I, because we all know about the Strait of Hormuz by now. 20% of the global oil passes through that. Shipping traffic has collapsed by up to 90% during peak tensions. So the beginning to the middle of this war, and we saw oil prices surge above $100 per barrel. This is amid all of these disruptions. And you can engage with us. You can give us a call. What do you make of this? Do you think this is something as South Africans we should welcome, or it should be a cause of concern? Because this is essentially Iran saying, well, South Africa, you are on our side. And we know we've been at loggerheads with the United States of America for a very, very long time now. And that has had its own implications. But should we look at this moment to say, you know what, the global order is being reshaped, and South Africa has been very unequivocal when it comes to where it stands, our BRICS Plus partners, and where we see the world evolve into. And this statement almost reinforces that. Iran in the middle of the war, the Strait of Hormuz closed, a very, very dangerous place now for a lot of countries. The United States of America, its allies, and Israel in particular, being barred at all from passing through the strait. And Iran coming out and saying, well, South Africa, you can pass through. Any vessels that are linked to you, that are going to South Africa, or linked to South Africa in any way, well, they can pass without any fear. What do you make of this? Do you appreciate the statement? Do you think it proves a point of where South Africa finally stands? Our studio line is 0116800355. On WhatsApp, you can send us a message, voice note on 0617660355. This is a story that we're going to continue to be following quite closely. The Iran-Israel, the US-Israeli war on Iran, and most importantly, how it's affecting you and I here at home. A lot is still going to be happening. That deadline from Donald Trump is coming to an end early Wednesday, midnight Wednesday, South African time, and it'll be interesting what comes up after that. But yeah, keep tuning to Salam Media. We'll continue to give you the latest on that front. Otherwise, you can take a quick break. When we come back, it's hashtag Africa Focus.